Hello, this is a tutorial by Coaches Across Continents, a global collaboration of organizations that implement education outside the classroom through purposeful play. This tutorial gives you an introduction into adapting and creating games. This video will provide a step-by-step guide that can support you in designing your own education outside the classroom activities and games that are most relevant to your community. So I will dive straight into it. First, I will talk about how to adapt a game. When we are adapting a game, that means that we are picking an existing game that you then in the second step want to adapt. This can be a game from Coaches Across Continents or any other resource. It can be an indigenous game, a game you got from another organization. Once you have picked the game that you want to adapt, the second step is that you keep the existing setup, but you address a different social issue. So that's one of the core aspects of adapting a game. When we talk about the setup, we mean rules or equipment, different progressions. We can keep those, but instead of addressing a specific social issue, let's say for example alcohol and drug abuse, we then decide for addressing a new one, let's say for example social inclusion. So now I will go a little bit deeper into the different steps you need to take when you adapt a game. The first thing you would do would be that you identify the theme or social issue that you want to address. So that would be now the new theme you want to address. That could be, for example, social inclusion. The second step would be that you would then consider different solutions or alternatives for the social issue or problem that you have identified. So if we stick with the example of social inclusion, we could say, okay, we want to address and we want to make some solutions visible, like for example developing empathy for disabled people, or think of ways to include them. And the third step would be that you would then decide how to make these solutions or alternatives visible in the game. And that could be done by, for example, people being blindfolded. That could help to develop empathy towards people who are blind. I think the best would be if we go through these steps again using a very specific example. So I have chosen here a game that is part of the Coaches Across Continents curriculum. It's called Pair Soccer. It's a quite simple setup. It basically is a game to goal. So you have 2 goals, or you could actually even have more goals if you want. And you have 2 teams. And the only additional rule is that the players on each team are building pairs. So there's always 2 people holding hands. And those 2 people have to play together and are not supposed to let go of each other. Otherwise it is a foul and the ball goes to the other team. And then you just simply start the game, and and then you play a game to goal. Now, with this example of adapting a game, we want to address the aspect of social inclusion very specifically, instead of the general theme of cooperation and teamwork that usually gets addressed with this game. It's I think quite obvious that when you play with another person, there will be certain aspects that you will have to focus on that are very much helping you to cooperate with another person, to communicate, to develop skills, to work in a team, to work with another person. So and now I will explain to you how this game can be adapted to address social inclusion. It could be done by making one person from each pair blindfolded, or if you don't have the equipment, you could also just ask your players to be honest and that they close their eyes. There is obviously the opportunity to cheat, but that's a different aspect you can then focus on with your players if you want to. By making one person in each pair blindfolded, you would then start the game, and you could even make a progression within the game where only the blindfolded player would be allowed to touch the ball and play the ball. This obviously changes a little bit the dynamic of the game. Instead of both people in each pair being able to see, now only one person can see. And that will obviously need additional communication. It will give the person who can see a feeling of what it needs to give guidance, to give support to the person who is blind. And to the person who is blindfolded, it will give a feeling of what it means to be blind and not be able to see. And you can then, during the game, you can have a short break and then also ask a couple of questions. For example, one question could be, how did you feel when you are blindfolded? How did it feel to be led by somebody else? Were you able to trust? What were some challenges for the person that was able to see? What were some challenges for you when you were able to lead and give directions? And these examples are just a few. The questions you can ask are kind of endless, and I think that also a lot of questions may arise from the situation and from the actual game. If you observe as a coach the game, you will be able to ask some interesting questions that are relevant to your players. Okay, I hope this example was showing you or helping you to understand what it means to adapt the game. Now I want to very briefly focus on what does not count as an adaptation. And the following adjustments that you can see on this slide do not count as adaptations. That would be, for example, to change the size of the pitch, to make it either bigger or smaller. Secondly, to change the number of taggers or players, or the number of safe spaces or players that are representing something in a game. So to change simply the number of them, to add or take some of these things out, that would not count as an adaptation. Also to alternate the game between playing with hands or feet or vice versa would not be an adaptation. And lastly, simply replacing the objects that represent something in the game. For example, instead of using balls, now using a rock, or that wouldn't count as an adaptation either. So let's move on to the second way of designing your own curriculum, your own games, is how to create a game. And I think this will now hopefully help you also to understand a little bit this distinction between adapting and creating games. Although I can also say that the difference between adapting and creating games can sometimes be very minor, and it's not always that easy to draw a very accurate line between adaptation and creation. Okay, creating games obviously takes a few more steps than adapting games, because you're basically creating an activity, a purposeful play activity or game from scratch. So first, what you would need to do is you would need to identify the problem or social issue you want to address. I, for this example, chose now alcohol and drug abuse. So you would basically see that, for example, alcohol and drug abuse is an issue in your community, and that would be the first step. So look closely what the problems or challenges or questions are that your players, that your team has, or things that you can witness in your day-to-day life, and then you can start with the first step. The second step would be to identify and decide for a specific topic you want to address within the social issue you have addressed or that you have identified. Because again, with the example of alcohol and drug abuse, this is a big topic. So we could, for example, focus on the effects and consequences of alcohol and drug abuse. But we could also instead focus on reasons for alcohol and drug abuse. Why do people get addicted? Or we could also focus on different ways and forms to prevent alcohol and drug abuse. And these are just 3 examples, specific examples and specific topics within the broader social issue of alcohol and drug abuse. And there's many more topics you can address it with it. It's very important to take this step because otherwise your game might not be as enjoyable if you try to address alcohol and drug abuse in general. You need to be clear on the specific topic you want to address. Then the 3rd step would be to consider solutions or alternatives for the specific issue that you have identified and that you want to address. So for example, if you talk, or if you have decided that you want to focus on the different reasons for alcohol and drug abuse, you can then also think of safe spaces for children and youth to be safe from alcohol and drug abuse. But you can also think about different ways to avoid alcohol abuse. So this could be the solutions, like to think of different safe spaces, to think of different ways to avoid alcohol and drug abuse, to think of different ways how you can prevent alcohol and drug abuse, or how you can also become sober once you have been or become a drug or alcohol addict. Now we're going into the second phase. This is now more after you have done kind of the theory work, you're now going into actually developing the game and bringing it onto the field. So now you need to, and that is the challenging and also very interesting work, is to now decide how you can make the problem and the solutions that you have identified in the first 3 steps visible in the game. So for example, you can decide, I will play this game that has taggers, and these taggers will represent the drug abusers. Or balls will represent different safe spaces. Or goals will represent different ways to avoid alcohol and drug abuse. You can see I'm now just playing with different ideas, giving you different examples. I'm not developing with you now a specific game. I will do that in the second step. I'm just giving you examples of how different things, different people, different items can represent the problems as well as the solutions. Then the next step would be that you would need to decide about the setup as well. So you would need to decide for the balls and the size of the pitch, for the material. Do you have teams? Do you have taggers? And then you also would need to think about the different rules. Like, are there some people who are not allowed to run? Or are there some teams that have a limited number of touches? Or some players that can only walk, for example? And so these different steps that I'm describing now here under D and E, and I will just show you F in a second, they are intertwining with each other. It's not that you have to strictly go with this order. They will intertwine and overlap. Another aspect that you need to consider and include when you develop a game is that you need to decide about different progressions, or if your game will have progressions, to make the game more challenging. So for example, you can start with only 1 ball at the beginning, and then as the game progresses in the progression you add more balls to make it more difficult, or you add more obstacles, or you also take obstacles away. And this can then help you, or can lead to creating more conflict, or it can also make the solutions visible in the game. To give you another example, you start a game and first there's no safe spaces. Let's say there's a game with taggers, and there's no way to escape from them. The only way to escape is to run away. But then in the progression, there are safe spaces. So you introduce new rules, you introduce new equipment, you introduce these safe spaces to make the solutions visible. So I hope you can see that in my explanation and in my talking, I'm jumping a lot between these different steps D, E, and F, because, as I already mentioned, they are intertwining a lot. Okay, now we have done the paperwork. Almost. There's one more step, a very important one, G, under the letter G, which is thinking of questions that the coach can ask. Or that you can ask if you are the coach. So for example, questions could be, how did it feel to be a drug abuser? If we stick with the example of alcohol and drug abuse. Or what did you do to avoid drugs and alcohol? Where did you go? And then obviously you can also relate these to life, to real life situations, and ask, oh, where in life can you go to avoid drugs and alcohol? And so on and so on. So the questions are usually endless, and also they depend a lot on how the game develops. But it's always good to have a couple of questions ready to ask during the game, and usually also a few questions after the game. But again, that's up to you how you do that. Okay, after we have done the paperwork, we are now going onto the field, and the very exciting part starts. It's the implementation. And that would be the first and simple step would be to decide for a game name, but then the next step would be to play the game, to implement it on the field, to actually get a feeling for it, and also gain experience, what is working, what is not working, what needs to be improved. Because after you have played the game, you can then reflect on it and make adjustments. So you go again through the points that I explained on the previous slides. And that it's kind of a circular process where you develop a game, implement it on the field, and then adjust it and make it better. And now on the final page, I would like to explain a few steps or guidelines on how to name games on Sports Session Planner. As you are participating in the resource, Coaches Across Continents resource curriculum design on Sports Session Planner, I would like to ask you to follow the following guidelines on when entering your games on SSP into your SSP account. So when you enter a game and you want to save it, you will always be asked to give it a title. And in this title of the game, you could please enter your name, the name of your organization in brackets, and then the name of the game and the social theme it addresses. So I have made an example with myself. So my name is Markus Bench, my organization is Coaches Across Continents, CAC. I have now made up a name for a game, could be Strategize for Climate Change, and then the social theme that gets addressed is very obviously in the field of environment or environmental protection. So if you could follow this pattern, that would be very helpful also for other people to find your games and to search for games if they are looking for a specific topic. Okay, I hope this tutorial was helpful. Thank you very much for your attention, and good luck with designing your own games.